In the previous lesson, we summarized the ministry of the Old Testament prophets. In this lesson, we'll be talking about how Israel and Judah were forcibly dispersed among the nations. Even in the 21st century, approximately half of the Jews in the entire world still do not live in Israel. Fully 50% of the Jews worldwide live in what is known as the diaspora, or the scattering of Jews outside the Promised Land. That, of course, doesn't count the northern tribes of Israel that were scattered to the four winds and lost their identity or mixed with other people 2,700 years ago. So in this module, we'll talk about how this diaspora began. You've seen this chart before, but let me review so that we understand how these dispersions fit into what was going on in the world at the time. The empires of Sumer, Akkad, and Old Babylon were the cradle of human civilization as far back as around 3000 before Christ. Egypt and the Hittites rose to power soon after that. And as a side note, the first civilizations in India and China arose around that same time. Then, under David and Solomon, Israel briefly became an empire in the 1000s to 900s BC. Assyria rose to power when Israel divided into two kingdoms. Then Babylon conquered Assyria and experienced a revival of their power under King Nebuchadnezzar. In 536 BC, the Medes and the Persians under King Cyrus overthrew Babylon. Then in turn, the Persians were themselves overthrown by Alexander the Great and his Greeks in the 300s. Finally, the Greeks were swallowed up by the Roman Empire about the middle of the 2nd century BC. Continuing our running start, under the ministry of Samuel, the tribes of Israel were united into a kingdom under Saul. Then David and his son Solomon strengthened the kingdom and formed an Israelite empire by subduing the surrounding nations and defeating the early aggression of the Assyrians. However, after Solomon's time, Israel lapsed into unfaithfulness and split into two kingdoms, Israel in the north under a succession of different dynasties, and Judah in the south, where David's descendants continued to rule. The northern kingdom, Israel, was characterized by large-scale apostasy, which means a falling away from faith. As a people, they never really served the Lord wholeheartedly after that, although there were always some in the northern kingdom who remained faithful. God sent powerful prophets among them who encouraged the remnant of Israel to remain faithful, but for the most part, it had little permanent effect. Meantime, Assyria took advantage of the chaos to expand their own empire. So the hardening of Israel into stubborn disobedience coincided with the rise of the Assyrian Empire. God had said that he would bless Israel as long as they remained faithful, but that he would remove his blessings if they did not. The empire of united Israel did fall apart, and many of its people lapsed into idolatry, and so they became victims of Assyria's aggression. As they expanded, the Assyrians forced surrounding nations to pay tribute money. Israel sometimes paid this money while refusing at other times. On several occasions, Assyria raided Israel, taking many captives. Finally, in the late 700s BC, Israel refused to pay tribute altogether and made a treaty with Egypt. The Assyrians retaliated then by besieging their capital, Samaria. Egypt was nowhere to be found. The Assyrians conquered it in 722 BC, killing many Israelites and dispersing the survivors to northern Syria, southern Turkey, and northwestern Iran. These dispersed Israelites eventually migrated in every direction, and I believe now form a part of the genetics of many different nations. What about Judah? The years leading up to the conquest of Judah by the Babylonians were marked by increasing political instability and serious spiritual compromise. Judah did better, of course, than Israel at staying true to the covenant, but they still had their ups and downs. Ultimately, they chose unfaithfulness, and they suffered judgment just as their northern kinsmen had done. In the years before the Babylonian conquest of Judah in 606 BC, Jeremiah had been warning of Judah's imminent judgment. In the early days of his ministry, Jeremiah urged the people to be faithful to the Lord, but their hearts were hard, so that by the end of his ministry, he simply counseled surrendering to the Babylonians. Why? To make it easier on themselves. There's a prophet I have mentioned before, but I want to emphasize again before we get into the exile, and that's Ezekiel. Ezekiel came from a priestly family and was the son of someone called Buzi. Now, although that name of Buzi was very unusual, it may have been the actual name of his father. However, in Hebrew, Buzi means someone who's despised. And that's why some Jewish traditions claim that Ezekiel's actual father was none other than Jeremiah himself, who was deeply despised by the Judean nobility. Jeremiah was also a priest and would have been a generation or so older than Ezekiel, who was a priest. His ministry echoed Jeremiah's and lasted from 593 to 571 BC. So his ministry was from about 10 years after Jerusalem's conquest by Nebuchadnezzar until the final destruction of the city and the temple, and well into the exile. Ezekiel is said to have lived in exile with his wife in Babylon in the Jewish colony of Tel Aviv on the Kibar Canal, perhaps the great irrigation canal built by Jewish captives connecting the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. Ezekiel seems to have had two main phases of his prophetic ministry. The first was while he was still in Jerusalem serving as a priest in the temple. Like Jeremiah, he counseled surrender to the Babylonians. Judah's sin was worse than Israel's, he said, because they at least had some knowledge of God under several faithful kings. Then came Ezekiel's own exile. This second phase of his ministry was in Babylon, and at this time he counseled the Jews to hope in God's forgiveness and restoration back to their land. In his famous vision at the time, he saw a future restored temple in Jerusalem and an expanded Israel, with each of the tribes receiving much larger allotments of land than they had under Joshua. Ezekiel is known for his symbolic actions, trances, and strange visions like the wheels within wheels and the four living creatures covered in eyes. He lay down on his side for an extended time to symbolize Israel's punishment by God. And like Hosea, he pictured Judah's unfaithfulness to God as like an unfaithful wife to a righteous husband. This comparison illustrates his message that the destruction of the kingdom of Judah was a judgment for their persistent infidelity to God and his covenant. Okay, now the exile. The first wave of exiles from Judah to Babylon took place in 606 BC. The exiles were young men of the royal family and other influential groups of people, hostages more or less. Daniel and his friends were part of this hostage program meant to keep the Judean ruling classes in line. A second wave took place in 597 BC, and it took away the upper and middle classes, and this is when Ezekiel was exiled. A third wave took everyone else in 586 BC. In one degree or another, the Judean diaspora has continued to this very day. Although the state of Israel was established in 1948 and many Jews have returned to the Promised Land since then, lots of Jews still remain in the very diaspora that began 2,600 years ago. Let's put the exile into prophetic perspective. In chapter 25 of his book, Jeremiah predicted that Judah's forced exile would last 70 years. Here's what he said in verses 11 and 12. This whole country will become a desolate wasteland. And these nations, and here he's referring to Judah and the other nations of the region, will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. But when the 70 years are fulfilled, I will punish the king of Babylon and his nation and the land of the Babylonians for their guilt, declares the Lord, and will make it desolate forever. Okay, let's see how that worked out. The first exiles were taken in 606 BC. The rest followed shortly thereafter. As I said, the Babylonians were defeated by the Persians. One of the first acts of the Persian king Cyrus after defeating the Babylonians in 536 BC was to decree that any Jews who wished could return from captivity to their homeland. So let's do the math. 606 BC minus 536 BC. What do you know? That's exactly 70 years. Isn't that amazing? It turned out just as Jeremiah said it would. Now remember that when the Assyrians destroyed the kingdom of Israel and dispersed the Israelites in 722 BC, they also brought conquered peoples in from distant lands and resettled them around the Israelite capital of Samaria. There they mixed with the few Israelites that had somehow managed to escape the dispersion. This mixture produced the people that the Bible calls Samaritans. From their very beginnings, the Samaritans were bitter enemies of the Jews. They claimed rights to the blessings of Abraham through their partial Israelite genetics, and they put together a religion more or less based on the Torah, the books of Moses. They had their own temple on Mount Gerizim. They had their own priesthood, their own customs, and they resented it deeply when the Jews returned and began to rebuild. They even threatened to attack the Jews several times, so there was no love lost either way. All right, let's take a look at what happened during those 70 years that the Jews were exiled in Babylon and later in Persia. Here are some of the outcomes. Well, first of all, though David's family line continued during and after the exile, it was never allowed to put a descendant of David on the throne of Israel or Judah again. Why? Because Israel was dispersed to the four winds, and the Jews were dominated by other nations: Babylonians, Persians, and eventually the Greeks and Romans. A prominent descendant of David named Zerubbabel did lead some Jews back to Jerusalem from exile in 536 BC, but he was never king. We'll talk more about him later. Second, the temple built by Solomon lay in ruins, and that meant that the system of worship and sacrifice led by priests and Levites was interrupted. So since they didn't have a temple and their Levites were essentially non-functional, at least in terms of the rites of worship, the Jews did the very best they could by meeting together in homes or maybe other kinds of large buildings. These places where Jews met weekly on the Sabbath were called synagogues. I mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating that tradition says that the first synagogue met in the home of the prophet Ezekiel in exile. From that time to this, synagogues have been the main places where Jews have met to worship. Even when a second temple was built after the exile and worship there was restored, Jews continued to meet weekly in their local synagogues as well. Another outcome of the exile was the fact that Hebrew ceased to be used as a language that was spoken at home and in daily life. Instead, Jews picked up the language of their captors, which was Aramaic, a related language that was spoken in Babylon. Other Jews learned to speak Greek in Western lands dominated by Greek culture. So what happened to Hebrew, the language that the Old Testament is actually written in? Well, it became a ceremonial language, a language that you had to learn in order to read and study the Scriptures. Well, not everybody could do that. So for many Jews, there needed to be a translation of the Scriptures into the languages that they actually spoke. For instance, in the 200s BC, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament was made for Greek-speaking Jewish exiles. This translation is called the Septuagint, which leads to another important outcome. Once the Jews were dispersed and their scriptures were translated into Greek, many Gentiles, remember that Gentiles are non-Jews, many Gentiles suddenly became exposed to the faith of the Jews and to their God. How? Well, through the influence of the dispersed Jews and Israelites living among them and access to the Greek Septuagint. This exposure to God and the Hebrew Scriptures would have a huge impact on the spread of the gospel several centuries later, when the church began to spread the good news. Yet another outcome was the rise of Jewish sects or groups like the Pharisees, Sadducees, and others. The Pharisees came into being when some Jews realized that their conquest and exile were a direct result of their unfaithfulness to God and His covenant. So in exile, many Jews came to the conclusion that, well, because they had been judged for not following the law, they could avoid future judgment by strictly obeying the law down to the last letter. So they gathered under the leadership of Jewish teachers or rabbis who vowed to, quote, build a hedge around the law. In other words, they built a wall of extra rules and super strict interpretations in an attempt to protect the law itself. Their new rules and interpretations were often far more stringent than what the law of Moses required. The Pharisees' thinking went something like this: if people keep our stricter human laws, they won't be in danger of breaking God's laws. This made the Pharisees into the strictest form of Judaism, and Orthodox Jews tend to be their descendants today. Later we'll see that Jesus had harsh words for the Pharisees of his day, many of whom had come to the place where they elevated their own rules over God's law. Now, don't misunderstand me. A lot has changed since Jesus' day. Judaism itself has changed, it's morphed and adapted over the past 20 centuries. Jews have had to do some changing because of their migrations, persecutions, and just keeping up with shifting situations. So I am not accusing Jews, Orthodox, or any other sect of being narrow-minded and exalting tradition over Scripture as some Pharisees did in Jesus' time. However, in terms of how Orthodox Jews over the centuries have practiced their commitments to keeping Moses' law, some have depended on certain rabbis' very strict interpretations of Torah, much as first century Pharisees did. So, the Pharisees were an exclusive, no-nonsense sect of Jews who tended to believe that other Jews were not very serious about God's commands. Here's what Jesus said to some of the Pharisees in Mark 7, verse 9. You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. Now, the Sadducees were an exclusive Jewish sect for priests and Levites. Their take on why they had suffered conquest and deportation was that the temple rituals and practices had not been done properly. So they tended to look down on ordinary Jews, and they formed a sort of elite class focused on proper rituals and ceremonies. Other groups like the Zealots, Essenes, and Herodians would form later when the Romans ruled Judea. We'll talk more about those sects in a later module. So after the initial shock of the conquest and exile, many Jews simply settled down and got on with life. They started businesses, they raised families, and they got used to the rhythms of weekly toil in the community and the Sabbath spent at home and in their synagogues. In one way or another, they were just trying to figure out what it meant to be Jewish and to worship the God of Israel now that they were out of the land of promise and without a temple. Some Jews, like Daniel and his friends, served in the governments of Babylon and Persia, becoming a people of great influence. Other Jews got so comfortable with life in exile that they had no real desire to return to Judea, even when the Persians allowed them to. But the reality was that for many Jews, the weeping over the ruins of Jerusalem and their vows never to sing the songs of Zion in a foreign land grew less and less as time went by. Hopes for the predicted Messiah were often crowded out by the cares of life, and any thoughts of what the Messiah would be like were very mixed. Some saw him as a military leader, a new King David, rising and defeating their enemies. Others looked for a great priest who would lead the people back to peace and prosperity through a strict observance and faithfulness to the covenant. Many Jews just ceased to care much one way or the other. And so it went through the 70 years of exile and on into the more than 5 centuries until the birth of Jesus, who would fulfill all that the prophets had said about Messiah. All right, the previous lesson took us into the dispersion and exile of Israel and Judah. Now we are ready for the next period, the restoration. But before we get into the restoration, I want to review the prophet Daniel a little bit more, and you'll see why shortly. Daniel was probably a teenager when he was exiled to Babylon in 606 BC. He was of the royal household, and he descended through many generations from the line of King David. He and his friends were actually more like hostages than captives, as I mentioned before. That was probably to ensure that the rulers of Judah played nice with their Babylonian overlords. Remember that Jerusalem was not destroyed until the 3rd wave of captivity. There were 3 waves of captives because the Jews kept rebelling against the Babylonians, and the Babylonians responded with more and more deportations each time. Daniel and his friends were taken in the 1st Babylonian captivity. They were taken to the Babylonian court and trained to be advisors, scribes, and government officials. You may remember the incident early on in their training when they were given the normal diet of the training academy, which they refused to eat because it was not kosher. In case you don't know, kosher is the term for the dietary laws given in the Torah that spell out what Jews can eat and not eat. In other words, the diet that they were given contained all sorts of meats and food combinations that they were actually forbidden to eat according to the law of Moses. However, since all vegetables are kosher, they asked their supervisor to simply give them a vegetarian diet. You may also remember that the deal was that they would have to accept severe punishment if their vegetarian diet didn't make them healthier than the other young men in the training academy. And it did make them healthier, so Daniel survived along with his friends. Daniel went on to have a long and successful career that spanned 70 years of service in both Babylonian and later Persian courts. That meant that Daniel was extremely old by the time he died in Persia. There are a couple of things that we need to remember about Daniel's ministry. First was his tremendous example of how to live a godly life in the midst of an ungodly society. Daniel lived a righteous life in pagan Babylon, just as Joseph did more than 1,000 years before in Egypt. There were times when Daniel served Babylon well and actually helped the Babylonians succeed in what they were doing. There were also times when Daniel spoke against the policies that the empire was pursuing. For example, when the king demanded that everyone bow down and worship him. There were other times when he personally refused to participate in any way, even on pain of death, like when he was thrown in the fiery furnace and later into the den of lions. Both times he was miraculously preserved. The second thing I want to emphasize about Daniel is that he laid the foundations for future prophetic events. It's in Daniel chapter 9 that we are given the timetable for the coming of Messiah, and that's extremely important. Verse 25 says, "From the time that the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens." That's 69 sevens. Now, we're not used to thinking of years grouped in sevens. We prefer to think of years grouped in tens. We have a name for a group of 10 years, and that's called a decade. The Jews grouped years by sevens. The only translation that we have for their Hebrew word Shabuah is weeks. So that's 7 weeks, 49 years, and 62 weeks, 434 years, plus a final week of 7 years for a total of 70 weeks or 490 years. Many scholars agree that the decree spoken of in its final form was issued in 458 BC by Persian king Artaxerxes, son of Xerxes. So 69 weeks of years until Messiah came is 483 years. Okay, let's do the math. 483 years after 458 BC is sometime around 25 AD, right about the time that Jesus began his ministry. Daniel's vision goes on to describe how at the end of those years, the anointed one, or Messiah, will be cut off and be left with nothing, certainly speaking of the crucifixion. Then Daniel seems to skip forward to talk about a final week in the future in which the events of the end of the age will take place. Now we know that the end did not take place 7 years after the crucifixion and resurrection. So therefore, that last week of years must be sometime in the future in relation to the time of Jesus. At that time, someone called the Antichrist will arise and greatly persecute God's people. This period is called the Great Tribulation and will bring with it the beginnings of God's judgment on the earth. When we get to the book of Revelation, we'll find that its author, the Apostle John, will pick up where Daniel left off. The restoration period in which the Jews resettled the Promised Land and rebuilt their cities lasted from 536 BC to around 425 BC, just over 100 years or so. The remaining Old Testament books like Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi were written during this time. As I've said several times before, in 536 BC, the Persians defeated and took over the Babylonian Empire. King Cyrus of Persia was more lenient than the Babylonians had been. He believed that conquered peoples would respond better to Persian rule if they were treated with just a little bit more generosity. And so, he showed favor to the Jews by allowing any who desired to make the journey to return to the Promised Land. He even sent the returning Jews back to Judea with some Persian money to rebuild the temple and their destroyed cities. The leader of that first wave of returning Jews was that Zerubbabel I mentioned earlier on. When they returned, a second temple was constructed under the urging of Haggai and Zechariah. But at first it was only a pitiful shadow of the glories of Solomon's temple. Nearly 5 centuries later, Herod the Great, just before the time of Jesus, would expand and make impressive additions to it. This refurbished Second Temple, sometimes called Herod's Temple, was the awe-inspiring edifice and complex that Jesus visited and taught in that we read about in the Gospels. But although many thousands of Jews did return, estimates based on figures given in Ezra and Nehemiah are upwards from 50,000 of them, many Jews still chose to remain where they had been exiled. For example, back in Persia, a Jew named Mordecai had become a prominent advisor in the Persian court. He was guardian to his much younger and very beautiful cousin Hadassah. The Bible calls the Persian king who ruled at that time Ahasuerus. That's how the Jews attempted to pronounce his Persian name, which was probably something like Kasharsha. The major enemy of the Persians at the time were the Greeks, and they couldn't pronounce his name either. They called him Xerxes. History tells us that Xerxes was entitled and unpredictable, and that his anger could boil over into a terrifying rage at times. One example of his fury occurred when he deposed his queen Vashti for publicly refusing to parade her beauty before his guests at a lavish banquet. Xerxes couldn't stand to have his wife publicly humiliate him like that, so he got rid of her and held the first recorded beauty contest ever. You might call it the Miss Persia pageant, with the winner becoming Xerxes' new queen. And guess who won? Mordecai's young cousin, Hadassah. The problem was that she was Jewish, and that was at a time when being Jewish was not popular in Persia. If the contest organizers had known Hadassah's ethnicity, she would never have been allowed to participate. So to keep her ethnicity secret, she had entered under her Persian name, Esther, which means star. Now there's a long story following this event, and I urge you to read it for yourself in the book of Esther. But the story climaxes with this. One of Xerxes' advisors, a man named Haman, absolutely hated the Jews and hatched a plot to exterminate all Jews in the Persian Empire. To make sure his plot went into effect, Haman actually tricked King Xerxes into personally signing the extermination order. Mordecai heard about the order and sent word to Esther in the palace that she had to do something to convince her husband to stop what was about to happen. Now, it was almost a certain death sentence to enter the king's presence without being invited. Even the queen couldn't do that. Esther risks her life not only by barging into his presence uninvited, but especially when she revealed to her husband that she was Jewish. Now, Xerxes not only spared Esther's life, but he also issued an order for the Jews to arm and defend themselves against the coming attacks. Esther's courage and faith in pleading for the lives of her people saved the Jews from genocide and changed the course of world history. These events occurred around 480 BC and are commemorated each year in the Jewish holiday of Purim, usually held in the month of February. So the first Jews to return to Judea did so just after 536 BC. Other groups of Jews returned in the decades that followed. In 459 BC, Ezra the priest returned from Babylon to Judea to make sure that the worship was being done properly, as well as to standardize Jewish practices and organize the scriptures into their current format. When Ezra arrived in Jerusalem, he found that all sorts of things were not being done in compliance with the law of Moses. For example, Jews were intermarrying with Gentiles, which was forbidden at the time. He also found that many of the priests and Levites could not prove their lineage. Ezra spent the rest of his life correcting these abuses. He then also compiled the later books of the Hebrew Scriptures and arranged them together with the older books to make our complete Old Testament. A bit later in 445 BC, Nehemiah, who was a high official in the court of Persian king Artaxerxes, was commissioned by the king to return to Jerusalem and act as a sort of royal governor. Nehemiah's great task was to repair the broken down walls of Jerusalem, which made it highly vulnerable to enemy attack. The book of Nehemiah records one of the great engineering miracles of all time, as men, women, and children labored together to repair and rebuild the massive walls in only 52 days. If you visit Jerusalem today, you'll see parts of those very walls surrounding the old city. So, who were these enemies of the Jews I talked about? As you might expect, when the Jews went into exile in Babylon, their absence left Jerusalem and other cities of Judah largely unpopulated. So other people in the surrounding areas just moved in. For instance, the Edomites moved up from the south into southern Judea. The Edomites were descendants of Jacob's brother Esau. The Arabs also moved up from the south. In fact, the first mention of Arabs in the Bible at all is in the book of Nehemiah. The Samaritans just to the north were bitter enemies of the Jews, as I said before. The reason for this is because when the Jews came back to their land, they found that the Samaritans were worshiping and making their own sacrifices to the God of Israel in a temple which they had built on Mount Gerizim. Samaritans had no use for the later parts of the Hebrew Bible, and they were claiming that they were the rightful possessors of the land that the Jews had once inhabited. Now, seeing these things as insults to God and a threat to themselves, and they were tired by the years of intimidation by the Samaritans, the Jews finally launched an expedition to destroy the Samaritan temple in 128 BC. Another reason for their mutual hatred was that many of the Jewish men who had returned had migrated without Jewish wives. After they were settled, they had married local Arab or Edomite women or Samaritan women and had started their own families. Others had intermarried with high-ranking Samaritan families in order to gain status and privilege and business advantages. Either way, the Jewish bloodline was being corrupted. When Ezra and Nehemiah saw what was happening, they insisted that Jewish men divorce their Arab, Edomite, and Samaritan wives and marry Jewish women instead. And this angered many of the Jews who had entered into these marriages or who were in some way involved in some kind of business relationship with these people. All of that to say is that from this time on, the Arabs, Edomites, and Samaritans would be bitter adversaries of the Jews. But Nehemiah's amazing wall-building feat gave the returning Jews protection and allowed them to get started again in the Promised Land. All right, in the next module, we'll see how in the centuries just before the time of Christ, many of these Edomites who moved up into the Judean territory converted to Judaism. The family of Herod the Great is one example of these forced conversions. We'll see that this ongoing feud between Samaritans and Jews will shed light on some of Jesus' teachings and actions when we study the Gospels. Well, let's wrap up. The Babylonian exile ended in 536 BC when the Persians conquered Babylon. In the 700s BC, Isaiah had foretold and called by name the Persian king Cyrus the Great. He predicted that Cyrus would restore the Jews to their own land after years in exile. And sure enough, in 536 BC, one of the first things that King Cyrus of Persia did was to send the Jews home, or at least any who desired to do so. Remember that the Persians had just conquered the Babylonian Empire that same year. Cyrus also gave them resources to restart their lives there. Three main groups of Jewish exiles eventually made the return. The first group numbered around 50,000, and under the leadership of a descendant of David named Zerubbabel, they departed for Jerusalem within a year of the decree. In the first 20 years after their return, these Jews built houses and set up businesses in Jerusalem and in the other cities of Judea. They also began construction of a second temple on the place where Solomon's magnificent first temple had stood. But then, because of intense opposition from surrounding people like the Edomites, Arabs, and Samaritans, work on the temple had stopped for a while. It only resumed at the urging of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, along with the support of Zerubbabel and Jeshua the priest. The temple was finally completed and worship was resumed in 515 BC. Things progressed slowly but steadily, and life in the Promised Land got back to some sort of normal patterns during the 3/4 of a century as the first group of Jewish returnees settled in. Then around 458 BC, a second group of 1,800 Jewish men and their households, maybe as many as 10,000 to 12,000 people, returned under Ezra the priest. They found that the first group were involved in serious moral lapses and careless worship. In other words, God and his covenant were not being taken seriously. Immediately, Ezra began serious reforms. He corrected worship, dismissed priests who could not prove their qualifications, and strictly enforced moral and ceremonial laws. A bit later, Nehemiah led a third group of unspecified numbers, probably smaller than the others, when he returned to Jerusalem. His primary mission was to repair the defensive walls of the city, which he accomplished in 52 days, an incredible feat of engineering and mobilization. As royal governor for the Persian king, he assisted Ezra in reform efforts. Again, things settled down and patterns of life were established for the returnees. Some 20 years later, the writings of the prophet Malachi completed the Old Testament canon, and they echoed the reforms established by Ezra.